thanks for coming, and we appreciate your time and effort to wake up early and to be with us today. As you may know, we're going to be today speaking about advocacy and how we could speak to policymakers. We maybe could start introducing ourselves and then we can start the session. My name is Mona Shtaya and I am the Campaigns and Partnerships Director at Legal Action.
And I'm Doug Christensen. I'm the Advocacy Manager at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, or TIMEP.
And we are here today because we thought that it would be good always to convene people and to speak about different tactics and different advocacy methods that we use in our advocacy. And you may have done advocacy work before, or you may be starting an advocacy work recently. So we are gonna have this discussion. If you have any questions, any comments, any examples that you want to share at any point, please feel free. Oh, it's okay, I speak English.
She speaks in English.
I'm speaking English. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, we're a small group, so we're gonna have a very interactive session, which is we're happy about. And I just want to start giving a little bit of background and context. We're living in a crazy time, and we have seen a lot of changes, geopolitical changes in the last few years or couple of years, but also since the beginning of this year, there has been a lot of changes. We've seen how also the digital space and the advocacy scene has been rapidly changing. We've seen a lot of changes when we look at our region and how the different authoritarian governments are operating, how they are collaborating, how they are unfortunately misusing the different technologies to suppress people, shrinking civic spaces, limited free speech, and how sometimes, unfortunately, the different digital spaces, instead of being utilized or used to mobilize and organize people as we've done back in 2010, 2011, in the democratic revolution in the region, now they are used as digital authoritarianism spaces where people are arrested, interrogated, and sometimes forcibly disappeared just because they've shared their opinions online. We can't look at our region ignoring what's going on around the world. We can also see the rise of far-right and the fascism in the different countries. I'm pretty sure you have a lot to say about the US, but also even in Europe, we can see how the far-right is rising, how the anti-migrant movement are also there, how the different governments are sharing the same tactics when it comes to all the basic fundamental human rights that we usually as an advocate for. I don't know, maybe you want to share something?
Yeah, I'll just add that I think we're very aware of the advocacy context we're sitting in today. I personally sit in Washington, D.C., and I think to pick up on where Mona left off, well, double standards are not new since October 7th and since genocide in Gaza happened. There's always been double standards in the international system and how we apply things politically. They have been greatly exacerbated, and I think we, really the two of us recognize kind of where we sit in our advocacy and how that impacts advocacy. So we're going to make sure that's part of a discussion today and make sure we can kind of have some candid discussion on it at the end. And I think I should also say this kind of lends into why I think both Mona and I in our own organizations and together always take a multi-pronged approach to advocacy. One thing we're really going to hone in on today is the need to really approach a multitude of actors and not just focus on one state or one institution. We really recommend kind of taking your issue and bringing it to a whole range of actors who can influence each other or who can amplify each other to be kind of more effective in your policy advocacy. I know Mona mentioned this, but I just also want to reiterate that this is really an introduction to advocacy. We only have 75 minutes, and Mona has to leave a little early too. I think we're going to be really focused on governments and international institutions today, but that does not mean that advocacy can't target campaigning in the public. Advocacy can target private companies. This is something Mona is really an expert in. So please note that whether you're kind of new to advocacy in the room or you're an advocate, like this is meant to be kind of more general introduction and maybe a space to exchange ideas, but I think we'd both be happy to carry the conversation further. We're going to start by taking you through kind of an introduction to what we call stakeholder mapping, and then we're going to do some interactive exercises with the audience on framing and kind of the advocacy toolkit, looking at some of the tools we're able to use in advocacy. And then we're going to kind of talk about the challenges that you all have faced, the questions you might have about advocacy, either internally or externally, and hopefully identify ways to overcome them or opportunities that can be made out of them. And finally, we'll leave a little time at the end. It might just be with me because Mona has to leave for a question and answer session. So we'll jump in because time is precious. So first we wanted to get everyone on the same level to start. So I want to first talk about kind of building a coalition and an exercise in advocacy we call stakeholder mapping. So the first steps to doing this are really first asking yourself kind of what are your policy objectives? What is the policy that you're actually seeking to change? And I think most importantly here, and one of the most important lessons we want to kind of pass along today is who is in the position to enact or advance your recommendations. In other words, who has the power to actually kind of make the changes you're seeking? One thing to think about a lot when you're thinking about stakeholder mapping is this idea of prominence versus effectiveness. I think right now in the environment we're in, we can really focus on this a lot because there are states, particularly the US and states in Europe, whose, I'd say, double standards really weakened them in certain global contexts. So for example, I work a lot on advocacy in Egypt and Tunisia, and I think those are two very prominent contexts where civil society there has actually warned, a lot of these global north governments about how their international pressure can put people at further risk, can be ineffective against dictators there, etc. So you have to think more about, who might be more effective. An example I use a lot on this in the US is looking at the US Congress. I know it's a very confusing institution, so I won't go into too many details on it. But I think oftentimes when a lot of my work revolves around supporting advocates from the Middle East and kind of accessing policymakers, and a lot of the times I think many people in the region know rather prominent voices in Congress for good reasons, such as somebody like Rashida Tlaib, who is the only Palestinian American in Congress, and frankly one of the only who is really calling for effective policy. Or maybe fair policy, but then we have to weigh it against effectiveness. And I always push advocates I work with to think about, actually doing the stakeholder mapping, which I'll jump into, which is identifying who's actually in that position of power. Because in the United States Congress, somebody like Rashida, no matter how much we love and respect kind of the power of her voice, doesn't really always sit on the necessary committees that would be more effective to make policy change in the issues we're talking about. And then finally, it's always so important to identify kind of what coalitions and allies already exist, no matter what issue you're talking about. So you need to build two stakeholder maps. The first one is identifying kind of who's either committed to the change you're pursuing, or alternatively, the anticipated beneficiaries of the change you're pursuing. What this means is looking at fellow organizations around you, and you should not limit yourself to just kind of human rights organizations or policy institutes. I think your partners in advocacy can be very wide-ranging. You can look at kind of protest movements, student groups, economic movements, things like that, and try to see kind of where you can tie things together. I think it's really nice that we're all at Bredina. I would say you're all taking a first step in stakeholder mapping by being here, so congratulations. I think in the opening session yesterday, there was a lot of discussion of how we as civil society can better coordinate and make sure we're doing a better job of sharing things with each other, and this is a really important step to advocacy. I think the first thing you should do before you're starting a new kind of push is see like who else is doing this around me, who can I lean on, who can I rely on, and this will pay off very quickly down the road. I think a lot of us are in a lot of us are in kind of coordination or coalition groups. I know Mona, for example, leads a really amazing coalition on tech justice, and DC I'm in some coordination groups on Syria advocacy, on Sudan advocacy. There are people in the room who I coordinate with every day and text for everything. So it's always good to rely on somebody, and I'll kind of get to it in the next slide, but it makes it as easier as hey, I didn't do the research, who should I reach out to on Tunisia? And you can kind of skip a step and cheat a little if you know the right people. And I should just say, I think as many in the room know, like successful coalitions are collaborative. I think coalition cohesion can be very challenging. But we always say to keep in mind that, you know, you don't have to exactly agree with everyone you're working with on tactics or strategy, but often if you're going to the same, or aiming for the same goal, you know, you can take two different approaches and kind of amplify each other's messages, maybe without completely agreeing. After you identify kind of who your partners are, you need to identify your advocacy targets. So your second stakeholder map is trying to map out the different entities that do or can affect the policy outcome you're pursuing. So I'll start with an example because we're all sitting in Beirut looking at the case of Lebanon, which right now is undergoing a very important transition, I would say, after the war last year. I just didn't know what it was. If we wanted to take the case of Lebanon and we wanted to do a stakeholder mapping on it, what we would first do is look at the international system and say kind of, you know, who are the major players in Lebanon right now? And I think once you do this mapping, you start to first unpack countries and states. So you would see, for example, the United States is very heavily involved, whether we like it or not, in the transition in this country. You will also find more traditional partners of Lebanon, such as the French. But I think really importantly here, you'd also find international institutions, which are extremely active here right now. So the example that comes to mind for me is the International Monetary Fund, which is going to have huge impacts on Lebanon's not just economic recovery and reconstruction, but because of that, its political transition and its stability. So it's important to kind of push yourself beyond just going to kind of one state and think about, you know, who's actually kind of interacting with this government right now and who's best positioned to pass on my recommendations. And it's super important to not limit yourself to the official body that's responsible for an issue. Because often the real power lies outside of that body. So I just used the example of the IMF, but another example that comes to mind is the Human Rights Council. So for those who have worked in Geneva before, you know, the Human Rights Council doesn't make decisions on its own. The Human Rights Council is a product of states which make it up. So your advocacy shouldn't really just target the council itself. Rather, you need to look further at the states that make up the council and their interests and kind of play into those interests when you're doing your advocacy. Another example that I just referred to is the IMF, which again we know has major negotiations going on in Lebanon right now. If you want to influence the IMF, yes, you can go to the IMF itself, and that is a good idea, but I think more importantly, you need to kind of break down the IMF in your stakeholder mapping and see who are the major players. The International Monetary Fund at the end of the day is a fund, which means it has major shareholders, which are the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, and others. If you break that down even further in each country context, you look at now who's controlling the policy on that, and this is where you get some confusion and why it's really important to stakeholder map. I think a lot of us are used to approaching, you know, ministries of foreign affairs or the State Department in the US context, whereas when we talk about international economic policy, it's actually governed by, in the US, it would be the Treasury Department, but in a lot of countries, it would be ministries of finance. And I'll pass it to you, Mona, for another example you want to chat about.
Yeah, so also it's similar to the States and to the UN. We also, if we look at the other bodies, like for example the EU, we can also see similarities because it's the same. Inside the European Parliament, there are states, but there are also committees where you need to do your stakeholders mapping. First, you need to look at who's like the one in charge, which committees are there, and which committees are interested in the topic that you are working on, and which committees are interested in the region that you are covering, and sometimes which countries in the region. Because, for example, there are different committees. One of the committees is like the Mediterranean Committee, or like the MAMA Committee, which is the Mashriq and Maghrib. Or there are also other working groups that might be interested in certain topics, like the civil liberties one could be also interested in digital rights. But if it's digital rights and then it's, for example, in Tunisia, then you need to look at the Mediterranean working group and then look at the civil liberties one, and then you need to speak about people who are here and here, like overlapping, and then you can expand. So you need to start like targeted advocacy on people who are intersecting between those two groups, because this would have like the maximum interest in the topic that you are speaking about, and then you can start expanding more people in the civil liberties and more people in the Mediterranean, even if they are not overlapping. But first you need to do the core group that you are identifying or you are mapping. And it's not only to do that with the state representatives, but also you need to think sometimes a little bit outside of Brussels bubbles, because if you are based in Jordan or if you are based in Tunisia and you have diplomatic missions in your country, then you need to think how can you reach out to those diplomatic missions, because if you speak to people in Brussels and they are not hearing and echoing messages from their diplomatic missions on the ground, then what are you doing on the ground? Therefore, you need to speak with those different groups. Maybe sometimes it's the same message, so you are not going to prepare something totally new. It's just like you need to make the connection. You need to tell them that, oh yeah, you like this is what's going on. You are sitting here in the country. You are aware of this, but we want you to deliver this message to your headquarters. And then you go to Brussels, and then you speak to people there. It's like the same kind of messages, but like you need to make make sure that the pressure is coming from all the different people who are involved, so you can escalate the pressure whenever you are speaking about the different states. And by that, you can be building pressure, so you can literally have like a proper stakeholder mapping, because sometimes if you just go to the foreign ministry, sorry, okay. Is it working? No?
It's the bottom.
No. Okay.
Yeah.
Is that working? Now?
Is this working?
Hi, no.
Oh.
Oh.
Test.
Test.
It's this one. Oh,
okay. Thank you. So yeah, technically when you do your stakeholders mapping, you need to think about how you can echo your message and how the same government can hear the same recommendations from their different representatives, whether they be in your country, respective country, or in Brussels, or sometimes even if you are going to the UN, meet with that country mission there and speak to them and deliver the same recommendations, so you can escalate the pressure. And by that, you can literally be building that pressure. You can be making your demands or your asks clearer to that policymaker. So we've done like some work in the EU on that level, but also jointly with DOG, we've done some work in the US regarding MENA and their involvement, and especially at the beginning of the ongoing genocide in Gaza Strip. And at that time, we've done some reach out to some senators. DOG thankfully did that. A lot of reach out to some senators, but we've done that because we've known, like, we map out who are people who are interested, like in their interests, in their previous work, in their what they have tweeted, what they have said about certain issues, and then we've reached out, we've spoken to those people, and then we expanded the circle. So we reached out at the beginning for Elizabeth Warren, and then we started expanding this circle. We started going to more people, and we got another senator, which is Bernie Sanders, on board. So this is technically how you can do that, because if you see someone who liked that topic, who's interested in that topic, then you can reach out and, hey, you can do something about it. If you are interested in it, just come on board and say something about it. So this is how you need to build the momentum. This is how you keep building and expanding the circle of people who are interested in the same topic.
Yeah, and if I could pick up on that a little bit, in addition to those two offices kind of caring about Palestine, the other reason we kind of had to do this stakeholder mapping is because in the United States, a lot of advocates working on foreign policy are often looking at two committees, really, and more so than that for the really technical experts in the room, but let's say two, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee. But for this issue, our end goal was to try to get senators to speak up about MENA's suppression of Palestine-related content, which meant we kind of had to look past these more traditional committees and look in Congress and see who it is it actually who oversees social media platforms in MENA. And this took us to the Senate Banking Committee and the Senate Commerce Committee, which is where kind of folks like Elizabeth Warren sit, and it's why we reached out to certain offices. So this was a rather interesting mapping we had to do. And then after you identify your targets, it's really important to identify their interests. I think a lot of people are kind of now seeing in the global context that we've been talking about that every government you're speaking to has its own agenda and its own interests. It often is not enough to just walk into a room, and we'll talk more about this with framing, and just say, you should do this because it's the right thing to do. You should do this because human rights are important. Unfortunately, every government you're speaking to, every institution you're speaking to, because the international institutions are extremely politicized, have their kind of own goals with countries, even things that we think maybe more value neutral, such as the IMF, definitely have kind of political agendas in countries like Egypt or Lebanon or Tunisia that you really need to keep in mind. I think material interests are really one variable in identifying a target's interests, but you also have to look at political trends within a legislature of a country that can be used to pressure leadership. We do this in the US, and I know they do this in the European Union all the time, where if you're not getting kind of the right result you want from the administration, you'll go to Congress to try to get them to put pressure on things, and same thing in other contexts. It's always important kind of before you're doing your advocacy and using the tools we're going to talk about to study them and understand what they're thinking and what they're assuming, because it will influence how they perceive the policy you want to engage on. And you also need to understand or consider how foreign influence is intersecting with their national and regional agendas. I think a good example here is the case of Sudan. I think it's important to talk about right now because of what's happening. But in the US context, it's kind of, frankly, not a strategic approach to just go to the US government and try to talk about Sudan without considering beforehand and bringing into the conversation the US relationship with the UAE, with Egypt, with other external regional actors who are fueling the war there. I think most importantly, you really need to understand your advocacy targets constraints. This is something that comes up so often. One time in a meeting on the Hill, one of my colleagues was asked, what do you want me to do about it? What do you think I can do about that? You really need to know what the statutory powers of the authority you're appealing to are, their legal authority, and really importantly, you need to know what their constraints are. If you go to a congressional office and you say, I think the Human Rights Council in Geneva should pass this resolution, they're going to say, what do you want me to do about it? If you go to Geneva and you go to the French mission there and you're like, I think the French Parliament should do X, Y, Z, they're going to say, this is not our mandate, this is not our job. So you really need to understand kind of what people's authorities and limits are. An example I love to use here is the case that I think a lot of people are following this year, is the case of Syria sanctions and the sectoral economic sanctions on Syria. In the US context, as soon as, before and as soon as the regime fell last December, Syrian civil society was rather unanimous. All sectoral sanctions must be lifted, and we know that the US sanctions are the most pervasive in the international system. But this is a case where it's extremely complex, and this is why stakeholder mapping and understanding constraints come into context, because there are different layers of sanctions. So if you were to go to the State Department in the United States and say, we think that the sanctions on the central bank on Syria must be lifted, they would say, we can pass that along, but that's actually in the power of the Treasury Department. Whereas if you were to go to the Treasury Department in the US and say, we want to see Caesar sanctions on Syria lifted, they would say that will require an act of Congress because that is written into US law by Congress. So it's really important to understand kind of the limits, the constraints, and the interests of everyone you're speaking to. And again, you also need to think about kind of what's the political context in the country you're appealing to. So, for example, in the US and Europe right now, we're seeing an attack on external funding, whether that be humanitarian assistance, development funding, or civil society funding. It's extremely important to keep this in mind when you're doing advocacy. This is a really prominent example because if you just walk into a room and you say, I'm here to ask for civil society funding for Lebanon without using the proper framing, they're going to say, well, we're in a time right now where we're not sending out any money. And this is something those of us who are in the US and I think also in Europe are hearing constantly. And I'll return to this on framing to talk about kind of how we try to get around it a little bit.
Yeah, building on the first step, what that we usually do is the policymakers mapping. After we've done the mapping, we need to think about how we are framing the problem. We sometimes think about because we are from the region and we are working in the region, we sometimes think a little bit in a very emotional way, I would say. Yeah, they are our people, we want to serve our people, we want to protect the region, we want to be an active members of the region. So sometimes we would be thinking about it from a very emotional way, and it's like a moral cause, like we want to tell the people it's a moral cause. However, when we do advocacy, all those claims, no matter what, how you feel about them, or no matter what, how important they are, they don't work. None of them, it works. Like, as anything in the world, like, when you speak to policymakers, he needs to feel the win-win situation. He needs to feel that he's serving his people. So you need to look at their interests, at their agenda, what committees they are sitting in, what they are interested in, how they can serve people. Because when they were elected based on their program, like that they run for. So they do have certain agenda that they are interested in that technically serves their communities. And when we speak about that, we need to make a connection between what the work that they are interested in and how that could intersect with our region. For example, if we look at Europe, there is a lot of people from our region who are like sitting in the diaspora community in Europe. I think there are 10 million Arabic speakers in Europe. So when you think about the framing, you need to think about those 10 million speakers, Arabic speakers, as active citizens in Europe. So if you want to do like public mobilization, you need to speak to your diaspora group in Europe. Like depends on the country that you are working on, or the state that you are working on. But if you even don't do that kind of public mobilization work, you need to think about their interests. One of the things that also you could look at is the MEP, for example. If we are speaking about certain MEP, the MEP and their agenda and what kind of groups they are sitting in, but also are they coming from a certain group? Because with the diaspora groups, some of them are coming like half Lebanese, half French, or half Iraqi, half Swedish. I've worked with a lot of MEPs who are coming like half from the region, or they are like third generation who are now like MEPs in Europe. So when you speak to them, you need to keep that in mind, and then you need to build on that. Being from the region is not enough, because sometimes that also could fire back. You need to build on that with a very rational point. Why they need to do that? How is that going to improve the economy? How is that going to improve the national security? Sometimes even you may find yourself in a room with someone who's even from right wing. So how are you going to speak to them? Okay, they are speaking about migrants, but tell them migrants are here for a reason, because you're not like doing properly in their countries. So you need to think about what you are doing wrong in their countries, so they can like afford to stay in their countries. So if you frame your messages in that way, you can have like a win-win situation. They would feel like, I'm not saying that we should speak to the right wing, but like if you ended up in a room with someone, you need to think about the messages that you are framing and how you can put that together. So you need to be like attentive all the time. You need to think about the framing all the time, and you need to do a lot of research all the time before you go to those meetings, because literally sometimes like one tweet that they put out there, you will understand that they are interested in a certain topic or in a certain group, or sometimes they are active on certain issue for some reason. So based on that, you take it and you connect it. And then you need also to look at the public hearings that they are running in the Congress or in the Parliament, because those public hearings, there are a lot of interventions from the different, I know this is a lot of details, but like you need to hear those, because they may say something that definitely agree with what you are demanding for. If you see that, this could help you framing your messages, like what you need based on what they said. You need to speak the same language with them that they are speaking to achieve what you want to achieve, so you can hit your target and you can achieve what they want to achieve. You make to, like we have to say it, you make to make them feeling that, you're doing the work that you're supposed to be doing. This is what you said, just do it, like just go for it. And here's how you can do it. And when you do the framing, you need to be very practical, very clear. Like you can sit with someone for an hour and speak for an hour, but then if you don't give them a clear recommendation like 1, 2, 3, 4, then your meeting is hanging out in the air, like it's not useful at all. You need to have a clear recommendations. Here is what I want from you. I want like, what we're gonna speak about the tools, not like, I want like a statement. I want you to send a private letter. I want you to get other MEPs on board. Like I want 1, 2, 3, 4. And if you hit those demands in one meeting, and if you finalize your meeting with that, and then you send up your follow-up communication letter, then you achieve the target from that advocacy meeting. If you didn't do that, then your meeting is just like was a blah blah blah, another blah 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 meeting. And I don't think we want to have more blah 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 meetings.
And before we get to the tools, we did want to kind of move to the interactive part of the session now. We were going to kind of do an exercise with all of these sticky notes, thank you to my colleague for buying them for us. But I think we have a small enough room where maybe I can just ask people to speak up. But before we got into some framings that we've relied on, I think Mona gave some really good introductory ideas there. We wanted to ask our audience to maybe chat with the person next to you or the people around you this question of which advocacy framings have you found most successful and which ones have you found less convincing. And again, I know some in the room are new to advocacy, but I also see some who do a lot of it. So yeah, I'll call them out if they don't want to volunteer. So maybe we could just take like 2 or 3 minutes to talk about that with the people around you, and then Mona and I will bring it back to the front.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, your main point is for stakeholders, two types, the beneficiaries, you gotta make sure that you have like something for us that beneficiaries want. Even though you might not so often I always want something every time the thing I've seen especially more grassroots stuff is sometimes people are so dogmatic interacting with a different type of framing that they don't visually I generally think like recognizing what the again, sort of point by point. I mean, yeah, certainly it was very citizen scientists in terms of actors who are very freedom of speech and some freedom of more controversial more as like a profit or part of this because you want to do this and I feel like it's necessary. Like I worked at a research institute that was all about labor rights and origin, but it's really just feels like shouting at the void a lot of times. And there's a more commission by liberation the same thing as I'm not I mean, yeah, they came up and there were fresh things that some of my our institute had to do still coming later. Studies or qualitative enforcement people are unhappy with it's like they said, I'm doing more half or at least maybe marginal policies power, like, and they wouldn't be it's weird though because like, veto anything anyway. Yeah, so I don't know. Were you normalizing that? So you can't make too much noise or anything besides like very small things. Policy advocacy on like a long time. At the end of the day, like systemic issues with dictators or I think the US might have more options.
They do. But we're talking about like this. That was a lot of our interest. We have a section of okay, everyone. Let's bring it back to the front. So do any of the groups who just kind of came together want to volunteer to share maybe with the larger group anything they talked about or talk more about a framing that they found more successful in their advocacy or less successful? Do I have any volunteers?
Yes. No.
Thank you. So in our group, we were discussing what are the most successful and the least successful.
Yeah.
So maybe we're repeating what you have said, but from our experience in Lebanon, for example, when you go and you speak emotions to policymakers, we know the emotions, we know that the Human Rights Convention protects the human rights, but at many instances, the policymakers know that. So if we speak what they know, we will not reach any place. So we spoke about the importance of going with the clear recommendations, because most of them, as you said, they say, okay, now what's next? So we need a call to action that is very clear, whether our stakeholder is a policymaker or the public. Even when we do a campaign, for example, okay, you mobilize people, you let them feel something about the issue, but what's next? Maybe we want them for fundraising, maybe to mobilize their own community, to build a movement. So being very clear is a key. And another thing, sometimes it's very important to understand who is your stakeholder. So in our stakeholder mapping, we say states, but who are in the states? Is it a department? Is it a state representative? Who exactly we're talking about? Of course, we spoke about the clear recommendations. Now, what we found as most successful is the clarity, understanding what we really want and how to send the message clearly. One also most successful tactic is that we understand whether we want to go public or private. So sometimes it's really important to go for public mobilization. For example, about the issue of refugees. Refugees are not welcomed in a certain context or in a certain country, so it's important to mobilize people about who is a refugee, why it's important to protect a refugee, and then from that you go to private advocacy, meeting with parliamentarians and etc. So choosing whether private advocacy or public advocacy and why we want that is important, and sometimes doing both at the same time is also a key. We also spoke about the chains of influence. Sometimes like your stakeholders need someone who influences them. So it's also important to understand who can influence who. Yeah. So.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Yeah. Anyone else before we bring it back up here?
Thank you. And I agree with everything that was just said, and thank you for the presentation. I agree. There's maybe 3 things I was going to add. For those who don't know, I'm Seth Binder. I'm the Advocacy Director at Middle East Democracy Center. I work closely with Doug in Washington. I think when you're thinking about the mapping, and I think you were sort of just hitting at this a little bit, it's really important to map out your opponents. If you think about it in that way, like who are those that would be against your policy, and why? Not just in the sort of the stakeholders, but those who would be funding them or also advocating towards them or lobbying them. So I think it's important there. And I think connected to that is that helps you build your counter argument, because then you can walk in and you know what are they already hearing from, this government or this lobbying firm, and let me counter that preemptively before they even get to it. Because they might not bring it up and they might just sort of dismiss it, but if you get out in front of that, you can really, it can be beneficial. And then the last thing I was thinking about that I think was also sort of mentioned, but I think it's important to think about, when you're going to policymakers, if they've done something in the past, they spoke out on this human rights issue in Egypt 2 years ago, 3 years ago, anytime you can bring that up and remind them, hey, you all did this and I'm asking you to do something very similar, but updated or connected to that even, it's really helpful for them, because they're like, I kind of already did it once. Like, what's my excuse now to not do it? So if you can do that research and find those things that they've done in the past, that's really helpful as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Seth. I think those are 2 excellent examples, and just to wrap before we go to our next kind of interactive part, I think Mona brought up 3 really strong framing examples earlier that I think a lot of us in the room probably rely on so often, which are national security, migration, and the economy. Particularly, I think in the digital rights sphere, a lot of times, particularly in DC, when we talk about things like spyware, we have to kind of put those in national security terms for US policymakers. Unfortunately, given kind of the context, which I want to be very, very clear was there before the Trump administration, but has only been exacerbated. I don't want to sit here and pretend that former administrations allowed you to talk in different ways. You often have to kind of say, you should be worried about this attack on a journalist in Jordan or Tunisia, not because it's a human rights case and you should care about human rights, but because what could they do with that spyware in the US context? What could they take from you? How could they threaten your national security? In the European context?
It's the same, because we ended up, sorry, I have to say that, but we ended up having like the Baker Committee, which we were doing a lot of advocacy for a few years in the European Union about the whole surveillance industry, and it never happened. Like, they never took like a clear action. The one time where they formulated like the Baker Committee and they worked on something concrete is after like the big investigation that revealed that some people, including some diplomats and journalists in the European Union, that they were surveilled with Pegasus of NSO. And at that time they say, oh wow, we're gonna have like this Pegasus, this Baker Committee. I sat on the hearing session. I gave a testimony a couple of times in the Baker Committee, for the Baker Committee, and the first draft report that came out didn't mention anything from like our region. It focused all in Europe, but we were giving testimonies from our region, like, hey guys, this is happening in Palestine, this is happening in Saudi Arabia, this is happening in Morocco. And it was never mentioned, so we wrote them back, like, we've been speaking to you, and actually to make it very relevant, we took cases for people with dual citizenship. We took cases for Palestinian French. This guy was spied up on a French soil. This guy was spied up on in like this country, and he's half French, half something else, half Spanish, half something else. And when we've done that, we've seen the other countries mentioned properly in the reports. If you don't do those linkages, usually it's hard to see like clear mention of the other countries and the other contexts.
Yeah, and I think for the Europeans too, we often try to appeal to both migration and the economy. Unfortunately, often you have to say, you know, you should stop the war in Lebanon because if you keep it going, Lebanon is hosting Syrian refugees, which you have not allowed to enter. Where do you want them to go? You have to unfortunately ask these very difficult questions, because if you just say you should stop it because that's the right thing to do, it will be less effective. And another example where I think we've done this pretty successfully is in the case of Egypt. We've tried to put a lot of human rights framing and framing on the economy. So rather than you should, you know, have a free press because press freedom is a human right, we've talked about what are the impacts of the economic crisis in Egypt when external investors can't access reliable information in the country because there's not a single independent newspaper that's accessible. How can you bring external investment to a place like Egypt or Lebanon when the court systems are not independent? So if you're an external company, why would you want to invest in Lebanon or Egypt when there's no fair contract arbitration or dispute arbitration? So we kind of try to use framings like this a lot in order to bring in policymakers. Next, we want to talk about the advocacy toolkit, and this time we won't give any hints beforehand. We want to put it back to the small groups and ask you to speak for 5 minutes about the types of tools that you've relied on in your advocacy so far, and I want to kind of clarify this. These can be the tools you are using to reach policymakers, but they can also be the tools you're asking policymakers to use. And a second question we had is, are there advocacy tools that you have found more successful? And then are there advocacy tools that you think come with specific challenges that you've kind of run into before? And we'll give you about 5 minutes and bring it back up here again.
Do we use sticky notes or?
We'll do the small group again, if it's okay. If people are more comfortable writing, please just wave me down. I'm happy to come give you a sticky note. Okay.
Should we do like?
We'll do this in 2 to 3 minutes just because of the timing of it. Thank you. Let's just go back and challenge.
Good seat.
No, that's
As long as you're looking fresh.
Sometimes we're sleeping. You don't have the time for it, right?
You ever watch it? Almost always the show.
Controversial things are more
But there's a confidence there.
that is actually reaching.
I sort of push back. So like wearing something for me, I'm like uncomfortable, sweating, like I don't want to wear a suit. I'm like worrying about that, thinking about like what would be actually. But I think there's a perception too. There is something about trust. You don't need a certain perception that they're expecting. Then like tune out.
I didn't know
What's my
I think
I don't know if there's but I think
so I wouldn't put it
I like all of your not very during the qualitative studies, these are your traditions that people here and Jordan's issue to be able
yeah.
They will print it out outside. They will print it out.
Okay, everyone, I think for time's sake, let's bring it up front. Sorry. Does anyone want to volunteer with any tools they have in mind? Maybe some new volunteers compared to the last groups. I know some advocates in the room I can call who haven't spoken up but have worked with me directly. Nadine, do you want to volunteer a couple of tools you provide?
Okay, so I also work with the Tahrir Institute with Doug. And I would say an example that we were discussing was when the escalation of attacks and atrocities in Lebanon, and how basically we used various tools of advocacy. First, we had several meetings with stakeholders in the US. Then we also had a memo on all of the violations that were taking place, which was also circulated to a lot of different representatives in the US. So this way there's no deniability. They can't say they didn't know what was going on. And then we also had a public statement that we had more than we got as many organizations as possible to sign on with us. So you had both public and private pressure taking place at the same time.
Anyone else?
Yeah, thanks a lot. We discussed a few tools together. I work for Oxfam, both in The Hague and Brussels. Basically, what we do a lot at Oxfam is publish reports, even though there's so many reports and so much data. So you really have to look, how can I use what's in this report to make it interesting? So what we do a lot is press releases, but also media briefings to make sure that they pick up on whatever is in the report. So we use what we call killer facts to really, use that with the media. So that's a really useful tool, and that then makes its way to the policymakers. Because if you just send them reports, they have so many reports to read that, they will probably not read it. So that's one tool. And then also you said that private briefings could be very useful as well. Certainly if a situation just happened, or different policymakers are still figuring out how to deal with that, they can kind of bring in this useful information to them in a private setting. So those are just a few tools I think that would be very good to use.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think the two of you point to almost everything we identified. This obviously is not all of the tools you can use, but I think these are kind of the main ones that we're relying when we're trying to reach policymakers. So you both mentioned advocacy meetings or briefings, and one thing I think has really changed in the post-COVID world is the normalcy of virtual advocacy. I think in-person advocacy still has so many benefits, but I think maybe if there's some good news, it's that we can now reach policymakers throughout the world, no matter where we're based, which is really important. You also both pointed to kind of advocacy memo writing or policy papers or reports. This is something that I think is so important right now. I think a lot of the work of advocates is to turn documentation into policy writing. To pick up on my colleague Nadine's example, during the war on Lebanon, we were talking to a lot of offices about the use of double tap strikes by Israel in Lebanon, and how some of these offices had condemned this when Russia did it in Ukraine, but they were silent when it was happening here or happening in Gaza. And we would show them tweets or Instagram videos from platforms like Megaphone News here in Lebanon, or just on the ground reporters in Gaza saying, here's a video of it happening. You can see the ambulance pull up. And they would literally say to us, can you put this into something else that I can give my boss? It's really hard a lot of the times for policymakers to take a tweet or an Instagram post or a reel and kind of hand it to their boss and say, this is evidence. But if an organization, like many of those in the room, is able to kind of take this, verify it and put it into even a paragraph with a hyperlink, they're able to then kind of bring that to their boss. So I will not discount the role of policy analysis. Mona was a fellow with TIMEP, Qassam was a fellow with TIMEP. They know that in my advocacy training at TIMEP, on the first day, I always say the most important thing you can do for advocacy is write and publish and kind of get your ideas out there, because a lot of the times this documentation, this analysis that can be living is such a useful way to influence policymakers. Another kind of option you can look at is media and press conferences and op-eds. We do this all the time. I think back there on the earlier question, you really rightfully pointed to kind of the combination of public and private approaches, and this is really effective when you can kind of have a larger campaign. Nadine, I think you also mentioned civil society letters or joint advocacy statements. I think so many of us in the room are all in the same letters all the time. This is also a really important tool to show kind of cohesion amongst civil society, but again, it's also a really important place to do documentation. Often, in the case of Egypt or Tunisia, when I'm looking for details on a political prisoner case, I go to kind of statements which are written by Egyptian or international organizations. And it's a really good way to kind of have all of the facts in one place, and you can send it to a policymaker, and it's very citable and kind of legitimate. A little more difficult, but I think important, are kind of legislation and UN and legal submissions. I'm not personally a lobbyist, but I think a lot of advocates do work on legislation, whether in the European context, the US context, or here in Lebanon. I think a lot of us are probably, who are working on Lebanon, are talking about some of the laws that are going through Parliament right now and trying to influence those. And finally, we have UN and legal submissions. Again, these are more complex. I'm not a lawyer, so I stay away from these and I let my colleagues do them, but we can talk about the Universal Periodic Review, which countries at the Human Rights Council go through every 5 years. Lebanon has its Universal Periodic Review coming up in January of this year. Egypt had its last year, so it's a really good place to submit formal submissions, shadow reports, to kind of build advocacy, and we do this a lot with UN special procedures as well. You can think of all of the folks in Geneva who can issue kind of press releases, who can issue, or who can do country visits. These take maybe more of a legal knowledge and mindset, but again, one of the reasons we want to do this today is to talk about how organizations can learn from one another and work together, and this is often where we see organizations partnering. Maybe one has the documentation, another has the skills to kind of put this in the framework.
Yeah, and with that, we are moving to our last topic, which is the challenges. We know, like, we've been speaking for 1 hour and a half, and we know it's not like a thinky world, so it's not easy to do advocacy. There are a lot of challenges. Sometimes there are internal challenges, sometimes there are external challenges that we are facing in our day-to-day life. Like, it's a crazy word, it's like a hectic thing, like every single, like, we've got like Al-Assad regime falling over a weekend. So this is like the type of region that we are working at, and with that in mind, we have a lot of challenges and sometimes even opportunities. So we need to look at that with a very skeptical eye on how we can use those opportunities, build on them, and try to do something about them. Also, we need to be very aware of the challenges, so we are not disappointed and then like we don't want to do anything just because like this is happening. And with that, we do have like the last two questions for you. The first one is, what are the internal challenges that are facing you whenever you are doing your advocacy, and if you have any external challenges that you have encountered in the past while you were doing advocacy. So again, like maybe because we don't have much time, so maybe we can just like have, if anyone wants to share any experience on that, please feel free. And at the same time, if you have any question for us, you can please also raise your hand and share it with us. Yeah, the floor is open. Anyone have a question or anyone have a suggestion or an experience, please feel free.
Maybe a technical question.
Sure.
Not like. So basically, one challenge, internal challenge I faced in advocacy, humanitarian advocacy, is that understanding all these entities, all these bodies. So how technical, very specific, as an advice for any advocate, what is the source of information, or what you advise us to do in order to understand all these stakeholders? Because I think some offices have the luxury of having many advocacy staff, but in country offices, usually it's one advocacy staff who is supposed to understand the local context, the regional context, the global context, and everything. So what tip you give us in order to understand all these stakeholders on a global and regional level.
Trust me, Mona and I both understand that.
Definitely. I can start.
Yeah.
I could start. I think research, and then chat with your colleagues.
Yeah.
I definitely find like it's so fun and it's so relief to find other people working in the sector. I sometimes just like ping Doc or ping Tim or ping anyone who's working in the field. Like, do you know anyone here? Or like, do you know what I should do here? I've been thinking about this. What do you think about it? Because sometimes you just need an external insight about what you are doing. Because your colleagues in the office, they don't do the same work that they are doing. Like, they cheer you up. Like, yeah, you're doing great. But then they don't know exactly what are you doing. So you need to hear from your colleagues in other organizations. So first of all, get in touch with other people. Ask them, I've been doing this. What do you think about it? Have you done any work on this? Have you heard about anyone who's doing this work? Because I might not have been doing anything on that, but I know like Doug is doing that. So I'm going to connect you with him. But also do a lot of research. Usually, if you're doing advocacy on the US level or UN level or EU level, usually everything is mapped like on the websites. It's not the easiest, the friendliest websites ever, but you can find your way out. So this is something also to keep in mind, but it's always like, we're always saying we need more advocates, so we definitely would be sharing more information and connect more people together. So always get in touch.
And I think to build on that, in addition to kind of your bilateral partners, like as Mona says, she texts me, I can tell you, I text Seth in the room probably once a week and ask him a question. I know I text somewhere too sometimes. I think it's really important to also do advocacy coordination groups. So as I mentioned in the beginning, you know, I'm currently in an advocacy coordination group in DC. One's on Syria, one's on Sudan. I am not a humanitarian, I am more in the policy space, but the group has humanitarian organizations, human rights organizations, policy organizations, media organizations. And this is very helpful because then you can come together as a group of 20 or 30 and say, you know, I want to kind of do this campaign, but I'm not an expert on this, and people can help you get in the right room. So they can say, oh, you should reach out to this person. I had a meeting with them last week. And I think it's so important for advocates and organizations to know their strengths and their limitations. I think, you know, I know that I'm not a humanitarian. I know that when it comes to those questions, I have to go rely on somebody else. I can't just kind of do everything. And it's really important to know when, like, you are the right person to do something or when you need a partner who can support you.
And sometimes you are the person who's doing that thing, but you have one example on one angle of the topic. You don't, like, there are other things that are happening. You don't have evidence on that. So I usually call our partner, like, we work with the 270 organizations in the Global Coalition for Tech Justice. I do have examples from Syria, for example, but I don't have any examples from India or South Africa. So I call my our partners there. I'm like, can you share please one example that happened with you on this platform so I can put it in our policy brief. I get that example and I put it in our policy brief, and then we can have like more comprehensive example. Like you build evidence, so you need to really build that completely and comprehensively. And others, I'm sorry, I have to leave, but I leave you in good hands with Dawn.
Mona has another event that she has to go to because she's too popular. But we still have a couple more minutes if there are other questions. I'll try my best to answer them.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I have a question related to the last discussion to know if have you ever faced some competition with an organization that can fight against this coordination? Because from the French perspective, what I'm noticing is that since we are reducing the aid help,
Yes.
we are noticing competition between organizations instead of collaborating. So I don't know if it is just a French context or
No, this isn't a
and
French
how do you do to win it? Because
Sure.
the big organization, they want to make the difference and they leave the grassroots organization, the little organization by the side, and well, it is contrary to our values on the solidarity.
No, this is an excellent discussion to bring up. Thank you. And yes, sorry I said it quietly, but this is happening everywhere. Everyone is facing the funding challenges, and because of this, you see this. I think we saw it before too, even where donors were involved. I don't know if I have a perfect example or a perfect answer to your question, but some things I would mention are again, kind of knowing your strengths and limits as an organization and knowing like where do I want to lead and step up on something versus where do I hand it off to somebody else. That's so important in like any partnership you're doing. but also choosing your partners correctly. You do not have to work with everyone who asks you to. I think, sometimes there is like a really unfortunate dynamic between some of the larger orgs and the smaller orgs, and I think it's critical to pick partners who aren't just kind of aligned with you policy-wise, but who maybe are thinking like you think, who you have mutual respect for. This is a learned process. There are hurdles. I think you'll stumble with people. I think probably anyone in the room who's done advocacy has been in a signal group that is like, please get me out of here. This is like a toxic space. But when you do find the right partners, I think it's about sticking to them. And yeah, I don't know if that fully answers your questions.
I was going to add one additional thing, which I think actually sort of answers that external challenge, is especially working on human rights in this space. Like, we are going up against incredibly powerful, well-funded, difficult actors, and that's not going to change anytime soon. And so it makes partnering even more essential.
Yeah.
And so overcoming the partner challenges is just I think it's just a necessity. To get the work done, to do the good work, you won't agree with everyone, you will have difficulties, but it's too important not to find a way to work together, because we will continue to be less funded, weaker, and the fight is too important to not try to find a way.
Thank you, sir.
Can I just respond?
Please.
No, I think we're all in agreement. I think there, and I think it's really important in this context. So for example, I'm working on gender justice, as which are a lot of feminist organizations in the space that I operate in. I think it's really important to come together and find a way to strategically divide tasks and expertises, right? Because we're all fishing in the same pond in that sense, and there's less and less funding.
Yeah.
But we're also sort of trying to keep ourselves alive as an organization. So we're moving where the funding goes and where the priorities go. So I think it's really important to discuss that together and see how can we really strategically move forward together, instead of being in competition, but also in terms of funding being in competition, which is what we see now, I think. Yeah.
No, thank you so much. I'm mindful that it is 10:15, so we're pretty much at time. I want to conclude on a really specific point that I think came up in the beginning, but maybe we didn't get too deep into in the Q&A, but I think it's really important to Mona and I that we talk about it, which one of the key external challenges I hear right now from partners in the region is, how do you talk to folks like the US, the Europeans, and others as they continue to perpetrate genocide in Gaza? I think this is something that advocates have a lot of really rightful feelings and boundaries about, and again, as I said in the beginning, the double standards aren't new, but there's never been a more obvious time for them. And I do want to talk about some ways in which I think, my organizations, but definitely Mona's as well, have tried to kind of get around this. I think there's a real global advocacy reckoning happening right now, and a lot of organizations are looking to kind of new states to be the leaders on human rights and trying to appeal to them. It certainly takes a lot more work, but I think there are ways to find commonalities with some of these states. I think some of the states that have been kind of the most, maybe, I don't want to say the most because I don't want to get into a discussion on all of these, but more consistent on Gaza and human rights in the European context are kind of Ireland, Belgium, Spain, but a lot of organizations are now looking to external contexts. So, for example, this year TIMEP did an advocacy mission to Geneva, and it was extremely important to us to meet with some states in Latin America who have been, much more progressive on Gaza. And again, this takes a little more work, but again, this is where you need to think of your partners and learn from other organizations. We as TIMEP had no experience really working with Latin American states, so we reached out to Syrian organizations because Syrian civil society are the leaders on this. They came up with this idea in 2011, the global north has failed us, we're looking elsewhere. And they created these amazing connections with, for example, Chile and Colombia, because there's a shared history of enforced disappearance in these countries. And Nadine was with me. We were able to do this in the case of Lebanon because there's also a shared history there. And I think some other groups to look at are the, I'm blanking on the name, but the Gaza group.
Oh, South Africa.
Yeah,
Colombia.
I think the group that's South Africa, Colombia. I can't think of
Group.
the Hague group. Yes, is another example of where people are looking. Obviously, I think these smaller states are still up against kind of the biggest players, so we can't ignore the US, but I did just want to kind of put that out there. I know it's a really concluding thought, but we didn't get to talk about it as much, but it's important. I want to thank you all for coming on behalf of Mona and I. I'm so sorry she had to leave early. Again, for those who are newer to advocacy, or if you have more questions, we only were given 75 minutes to do this. Mona told me this morning she's done a workshop on advocacy over 3 days. I've done it over 3 hours before. So just know this is an introduction, and I'm happy to carry the conversation with anyone who wants to keep talking in the future down the line. But thanks again for your participation. It was so nice to have everyone here.